competition. It's part of man's basic nature. The stories and records of human beings' competitive makeup are some of the best documented throughout history. Men have always sought ways to measure themselves against each other. As the 20th century began, the development of the automobile gave people more freedom and a new way to compete. From there, it didn't take long for auto racing to grab hold of America's imagination. Seeking the thrill of high-speed competition, the public flocked to races like the Indianapolis 500. But it was not the only place where racing was going on. Fascinated with speed and power, drivers found a variety of arenas to test their machines and courage. One of those places was a beautiful strand of Ocean Beach in northern Florida. Unlike the rough roads at the time, Ormond Beach was hard and flat, perfect for high-speed competition. The first time trials on the beach were held in January of 1902. Fledgling automobile manufacturer Ransom E. Olds won the trials with a run of 50 miles per hour over the straight measured mile of beach. As the years progressed, a variety of cars appeared to make their run at the land speed records. By 1927, the drivers were chasing the 200-mile-per-hour mark. And in 1935, Sir Malcolm Campbell was unofficially clocked at an incredible 330 miles per hour, but was only credited with 276 after he spun on the return trip back down the measured mile. Campbell's run in 1935 would be one of the last land speed record attempts at Daytona, as that show moved to the Bonneville Salt Flats. But it would not be the end of racing in the Daytona area. The sleek speedwagons driven by the rich and famous were replaced with modified stock cars owned and driven by common men. One of these men was a mechanic and driver from Washington, D.C. named William Henry Getty France. Bill France was an early pioneer of beach racing, but his real impact on the sport would be as an organizer and promoter. It would be France's vision and leadership that would take stock car racing from Thunder Road to Victory Lane. This is Daytona Beach, Florida. Its hard-packed sands still carry cars today, much as they did back in 1934. Hi, I'm Alan Bestwick. Welcome to From Thunder Road to Victory Lane, the NASCAR story. 1934 was the year that NASCAR founder Bill France stopped here in Daytona Beach. He was on his way with his family from Washington, D.C. to Miami at the time. Popular story was that France's car broke down while he was in this area, but that's not the case. Bill was an expert mechanic. He could handle anything that came up along the way. The real story is that France heard about the great racing and beautiful beach here in Daytona and wanted to check it out. He liked it so much that with $100 cash and a handful of tools, Bill settled in Daytona Beach to build his racing empire. 1936 was a year of change on the beaches. No speedruns were scheduled on Ormond Beach, but city officials, anxious to keep Daytona's reputation as the speed capital of the world, were looking for another event to replace the time trials. They decided on a stock car race over a 3.2-mile beach road course. The American Automobile Association, AAA, agreed to sanction the 250-mile race that would carry a $5,000 purse. Because AAA also sanctioned the Indianapolis 500, the first beach race attracted several top drivers, including AAA dirt track champ Doc McKenzie and former Indy winner Bill Cummings. Also among the 27 entries was 25-year-old Bill France behind the wheel of a 1935 Ford. The race lasted 4 hours and 54 minutes and was red flagged because of stuck race cars in the rutted sand of the north turn. After much confusion in scoring, Milt Marion was declared the winner in a Ford. Marion averaged 49 miles per hour and completed 75 laps to take home the $1,700 first prize. Bill France finished fifth and pocketed $500. Although a huge crowd was on hand, the city of Daytona claimed a $22,000 loss on the event and wanted no more of stock car racing. However, racing would continue on the beach in 1937. After applying a hardening surface in the turns to prevent ruts in the sand, plans for another stock car race were made. The sponsor this time would be the Elks Club. The Elks didn't have a lot of money for the purse, and they weren't kidding. Smokey Purser won the 37 race and earned only $43.56 for his effort. But like AAA, the Elks also lost money on the race and would not be back as a sponsor. The good news was that the turns held up under the punishment of the cars, and there was still plenty of interest in racing on the beach. All that was needed was a promoter. By 1938, Bill France was a rising star on the Southern racing circuit. France was not only a capable driver, but had also gained considerable knowledge in promoting races from traveling to various tracks. Confident he could get the cars and drivers, what France needed was money for the purse.
He wanted to see it keep going primarily. I don't think anybody thought you were going to get rich off of it in 1935 in Florida. So he basically did the legwork. He didn't have the funds himself. He had a service station at the time. And Charlie Reese, who had the nightclub, he agreed to come up with the financing necessary. So the two of them started off, and that's how it all got started.
The July 10th race drew 30 entries and around 4,000 fans paying 50 cents apiece. Danny Murphy held off Bill France for the win and the $300 first prize. After clearing their debts, France and Reese split a $200 profit. Modest as it was, the race made money for a change and gave Bill France a good start as a promoter. Over the next 3 years, France would stage up to 4 races a season on the beach, with the crowds growing bigger all the time. France was also finding success in his race car as well. He won 2 beach races and was unofficially declared National Stock Car Racing Champion in 1940. France was one of many emerging stock car racing stars in the late 30s. Smokey Purser was a gifted mechanic from Lumber City, Georgia, who would dominate early beach racing. Holding the philosophy, it ain't cheating if you don't get caught, the free-spirited Purser often bent the rules and usually got caught. Purser was stripped of his first victory in 1938 on the beach after he showed up for a post-race inspection 3 hours after he took the checkers. Race officials were naturally suspicious, and although they found nothing illegal on the Ford, they knew his reputation and disqualified him on principle. Purser straightened up over the next 4 years and won 2 Daytona races and finished in the top 5 in all but 1 beach race. Another set of Georgia drivers also found success during those early years. In 1940, Roy Hall was only 19 and had already gained fame as a talented and fearless driver. However, that reputation came mostly from the police that tried to catch him. Driving out of the Atlanta shop of owner Raymond Parks and winning Indy 500 mechanic Red Vote, Hall won the 1940 race driving a Ford.
I'd say on dirt, him and Fonny Flock is the 2 best understanding drivers on dirt I've ever drove with. You could drive beside of them just like you was talking to him.
Roy Hall was really more like a Curtis Turner type driver. He was very colorful, but he'd put the car right behind somebody else he was racing, and they'd fill his radiator up with mud, and the car would run hot, and he'd be parked, but he'd really be colorful while he was going. He used to drive cars for a guy named Raymond Parks from Atlanta. And Raymond was the equivalent of today's Rick Hendricks, you might say. He had 3 of the better cars, and one of the best rides that you could get in those days was driving a car for Raymond Park.
Hall was just one of a group of talented drivers from Georgia at that time. 20-year-old Lloyd C. was also an aggressive driver.
Lloyd C. was probably the Dale Earnhardt's in 1941. It's a race between he and Roy Hall.
C had a knack for bicycling his car on 2 wheels through the turns on the beach road course, a demonstration of his talent and guts. In only his 5th start on the course, Lloyd C. won at Daytona in 1941. C went on to win 3 races in a row after his beach triumph before he was shot to death by a cousin in a dispute over sugar content in the family moonshine still. His tombstone in Dawsonville, Georgia still pays tribute to Lloyd C., the racer. Stock car racing is dangerous business. Only the brave need apply. But for a lot of the early drivers, organized racing was much safer than the running they did off the track. Running from the law. Prohibition had spurred a new profession in the South, transporting whiskey or moonshine from mountain stills to customers who thought the 15th Amendment was a little too strict. Running moonshine and staying a step ahead of the police kept driving and mechanical skills sharp. It took a man who was tough, clever, and competitive.
The intriguing part of speed was not as attractive to me as the competition it was, basically. It was sort of a competitive type thing. When you went out at night, you didn't know what they had, they didn't know what you had, they didn't know where you was going or which way you was going to be coming, you didn't know where they was going to be sitting, what kind of a trap they had laid for you and that type of stuff. So it was like, I don't know, a cat and mouse type game, and it was who could outwit the other was the winner of the game. But you couldn't afford to lose that game. If you did, you took a trip up the creek.
See, when a car left Atlanta, they had these heifer springs on the back of them, and they was jacked up in the back. And these old sheriffs got used to sitting on the side of the road, and they could watch the car coming. And when they put 180 gallons of liquor on up in the woods in DeLonghi, they would level it down. But they'd wait on that car to come back and shoot the radiator out. And of course, about 2 miles down the road, the car would blow up with no water in the radiator. And the sheriff started getting 50% of what those cars brought in front of the courthouse. Every Saturday they have an auction. And the sheriffs really were making more money than they was being paid, so they got red hot on catching these bootlegger cars.
Moonshine runners were a proud bunch and would boast that they had the best car around and were ready to take on all comers. The only way to settle such disputes was to go head-to-head.
They had a bulldozer. They cut just about a half a mile track down about 18 miles down in Jonesburg, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, and no fences. And these guys the bootleggers, they own these kingpins, they own the cars. They was always gambling about who had the fastest car. And on Saturdays, 8 or 10 of these cars would show up, and finally people started showing up with no fences, and they actually would pass their helmets around the fences, 50 cents, $1, and that's what kind of money they was getting. But that was the very first start of racing those bootlegger cars on just what a bulldozer had laid out on a half-mile track outside Atlanta.
Roaring down the back roads just ahead of the law may not have been ideal training for the drivers, but this experience under fire helped produce some of the sport's greatest legends.
Well, it's a kind of something that you're not really proud of, but back in those days you did whatever you could to make $1, and I bootlegged some. So racing, the only thing I had to do was go round and round because I knew how to drive a car already. And I saw my first race and I said, well, they're not doing anything I haven't been doing for a long time.
1941 was a good year for beach racing in Daytona. Bill France was busy planning the 42 season when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into World War II. Needs for the national defense put a stop to racing as America focused on the war effort. The 4 years of war left Bill France starting from scratch in the race promotion business. France had promoted several races in late 1945 and got racing on the beach going again in April 1946. The 46 beach race was won by a disabled veteran named Red Byron in a '39 Ford. Byron had been shot down over the Pacific in a B-24 bomber and then spent 27 months in the hospital recovering from injuries caused by the crash, which included a shattered left leg. Byron's victory on the beach would be the first of 4 victories on the beach road course. 1946 would also be the last year Bill France would drive in competition. His promotional skills now honed, tracks all over the region wanted France to publicize their races. France formed the National Championship Stock Car Circuit and began promoting races full-time. As director of the NCSCC, France put together a full slate of races in 1947 and crowned 7-race winner Fonty Flock as champion at the end of the season. 1947 was a successful year for stock car racing, and Bill France felt it was time to better unify the tracks and promoters. So France organized a December 14th meeting at Daytona's Streamline Hotel with 35 of stock car racing's most influential men. The purpose of the meeting? To lay down rules and set up a governing body for the sport. The group came out of the meetings 3 days later with a set of rules and a new name. Several new names for the organization had been considered, but Mechanic Red Vote is credited with the one that stuck. The National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR would be the new name for the sanctioning body. Bill France was elected president and stated its objectives. The purpose of this association is to unite all stock car racing under one set of rules, to set up a benevolent fund and a national point standing system whereby only one stock car driver will be crowned national champion.
Well, you know, the problem we had then, of course, was it was tough. The drivers were tough. The racetrack operators were really a bunch of guys that would do almost anything to each other to get to walk on their turf. And what this whole ungangly mess of things that was going on, what Bill France did was come in and become an anchor and straighten all of it out as much as you could. And he guaranteed that when the drivers would go to a track that they were going to get paid because he got the purse up front. He guaranteed the promoters were going to have a good show. And also the other thing is he really was a great pioneer in insurance. And that was what was lacking with a lot of racing back in those days. Is a driver, some tracks ran with no insurance on the driver or spectator.
NASCAR sanctioned 3 classes of competition in 1948: roadsters, modified stocks, and the headliner strictly stocks, which would feature late model sedans. The strictly stocks class would evolve into what is known today as the Winston Cup Series. But in 1948, there was a shortage of new cars. None had been produced during the war, and Detroit was still catching up. So the bread and butter of NASCAR racing that year would be modified racing with mostly 1930s machinery. NASCAR ran 52 races in '48, with Red Byron being crowned its first champion. As a new sanctioning body, NASCAR had a good year, but still needed to separate itself from the crowd of other racing organizations. With as many as 6 different sanctioning groups with point systems crowning national champs, there was a lot of confusion about who really was the stock car champion. NASCAR needed to find a way to be unique. Bill France still felt that his strictly stock class was the answer. France reasoned that the general public would be more interested in a race that featured cars they could buy off the showroom floor. With no other sanctioning body using the division, NASCAR would then have a true national champion. That set the stage for the new class. On June 19, 1949, the first strictly stock race was held on a 3/4-mile dirt track in Charlotte. Anyone with a full-size American passenger car was eligible to enter, and the 33-car field filled up quickly. Bob Flock grabbed the pole with a lap of 67.958 miles per hour. Bob's brother Tim qualified next to him in the second spot, which is pretty amazing considering Tim had come to the race without a ride.
It's hard to believe, but I didn't have a car 1 week before that race, and Bob and Funny had cars, and we happened to see a brand new 88 sitting up next to the fence, a lady and a guy sitting and watching some of the cars go around the track, and Bob says, "Why don't you go over there and ask them people, would they let you run that car in next Sunday's race?" This is a week before the race. And I said, "Bob, have you lost your mind and people think I'm crazy?" He said, "Come on, I'll go over there with you." So I walked over the car, and Buddy and Betty 8 was in the car from Hickory, North Carolina, and they own the Hosier Mill over there. So I asked Buddy, I introduced myself, and Bob, I said, "How about let me drive that 88 in next Sunday's race?" And the lady, Betty 8, looked on and she said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "Bob, I told you what she was going to say." But Buddy said, "Tim, I'll be back tomorrow. I'm going to take Betty home tonight, and I'll come back tomorrow and let you know about that." And it's a brand new car. I think it had about 800 miles on it. Sure enough, he showed up the next day, and we started reinforcing the wheels, which NASCAR would let you do. And I finished 5th in that very first race.
The race featured 9 different makes of cars and would go 150 laps on the Carolina dirt. Bob Flock would give up the lead early in the race to Bill Blair in a Lincoln on lap 6. The race's only accident happened on lap 107 when racing newcomer Lee Petty rolled his Buick through turn 3. Petty was not hurt, but was left with a pretty badly damaged car to drive home. Glenn Dunaway assumed the point on lap 151 after Bill Blair dropped out with overheating troubles. Dunaway roared to the checkers 3 laps ahead of second place and apparently won the race. But a post-race inspection found the rear springs on his Ford had been spread for better stability, a violation of the rules.
Yeah, Glenn Dunaway won that first race, and after they inspected his car, it was probably an ex-bootlegger car because he had helper springs on the back of it, and they wasn't supposed to be on there, so they disqualified, and I think they give the race to Jim Roper in a big Lincoln
Well, we come with 2 Lincolns and we'll come with a backup car. We drove the cars then back then to wherever we were, and we drove through nonstop. We come to Charlotte. We were lucky. We win. We had a lot of controversy, and they tore the car down, and we didn't have any transportation home, and the engine was in pieces. And Lincoln dealer gave us a new engine, and we went from there.
A crowd of 13,000 watched that first race, and many who were there left with varying impressions.
There was a real curiosity factor here because, you know, you had cars, I mean, nothing like it is today. They were just right off the street. I mean, a lot of people drove them to the track. They didn't even take the headlights out of most of them. They just put an X out of masking tape on it and took the hubcaps off and went racing. It was sort of boring to me because I'd been used to the NASCAR modifieds, and it was a lot of action in the modifieds, and this was such a weird race, taking cars right off the highway, that I spent most of my time selling Coca-Colas.
Bill France organized 7 more strictly stock races in 1949, and within 8 months, the newly named Grand National Division had replaced the modifieds as NASCAR's premier class. Red Byron won the strictly stock championship in 1949 with 2 wins in his 6 starts. The 1950 season began in February at Daytona. The beach road course had hosted races since 1935, and the drivers had developed unique ways to get around the beach and road course.
It was a 2-lane road, part of it, and then you turn and come onto the beach, and that was the racetrack. And they didn't have any fire equipment or anything like that. You'd see a car burst into flames while somebody just hit the dust, you know. Brakes, you'd run it, by the time you'd run 2 laps, there was old bonded lining back then, and heck, you were out of brakes on the 2nd lap, and you'd have to cross it. You'd have to drop 1 wheel off the pavement and cross the car up on the pavement to slow it down enough to go through the turn. And on the beach, we'd set up a slide like this, you know, and that would slow the car down, and you couldn't see anything on the beach either. The people were lined up on the side of the beach, and you just run till you run out of people and then turn left.
We actually run right beside the ocean. When the tide went out, that's where we run. And you said, what was it like? I remember the spray off of the cars would get on your windshield, and you could actually feel the car over here, and you move over and feel it, and you couldn't see him because the windows just covered it with that spray, you know, and move over a little bit, and you didn't try to hold it straight. But it was real dangerous running down that beach with about 70, 80 cars, and the backstretch was real narrow. A1A highway, there was asphalt, and it was real narrow. I mean, it was passing those cars that was blowing up, just barely enough for 2 cars on that backstretch, and past the car running 140 miles an hour and him blowed up. It was tough, really.
Whenever you win Daytona down there first of the year, you were known all over the United States. In other words, people call you from California, everywhere else after you win down there. You mention, you call out there for something, tell them who you are, oh yeah, you won the race at Daytona.
Experience was important to success, but in 1950, a rookie won in his first ever Grand National start at Daytona. Former Army tank driver Harold Kite bested the 41-car field in a Lincoln and took home $1,500. Kite's victory was an indication of how wild the 1950 season would become. In one of the most competitive points battles in NASCAR history, 7 different drivers held the points lead during the 19-race season. Bill Rexford eventually outlasted Curtis Turner and Fireball Roberts and won the Grand National Championship. 1950 had been a wild year, but the big news of the season took place at a new track in Darlington, South Carolina. Peanut farmer Harold Brasington had been to the 1948 Indianapolis 500 and was thrilled by the spectacle. He wanted to bring the same kind of excitement to the South, but there was no track capable of hosting a 500-mile event. So Brasington built Darlington Raceway, a banked 1.25-mile paved oval in the PD River region of South Carolina. Bill France was concerned that the Strictly stocks would break down trying to complete a 500-miler, and that would be bad for NASCAR's image. But France didn't want to lose the race to a competing sanctioning body and went on to assist in promoting the first Southern 500 with Bracington on Labor Day of 1950. The purse was $25,000, the largest to date in NASCAR history. The money attracted a field of 75 cars and over 25,000 spectators. The Grand National regulars had not raced on a paved surface before and quickly found out what the key to victory would be.
Well, everybody had different ideas of what it would take to run a race there in Darlington on a pavement, because we'd never run there like that before, you know. And back then, a lot of us had recap tires. And we'd take a drill and drill air holes in them to try to make them last, and they'd go about 10 laps, and it sounded like the 4th of July down there on the first race they had. They had a truckload of tires.
What got us all, they started 75 cars, started them 3 abreast. And from the start-finish line, the cars was lined up all the way through the 4th turn and part of the 3rd turn and part of the backstretch. But it would look like a bunch of New York taxi cabs when they dropped that flag. 75 cars trying to go on that first turn, and it was really a unique track. And that was our first big track really to run on, and a big purse. I think the first place purse in the first race was about $25,000, which was unheard of back then.
One man in the field knew that tires would be a critical factor, so while everyone else drove their tires off the rim, experienced Indy driver Johnny Mance used a hard compound truck tire on his Plymouth. Mance took the lead on lap 50 and romped to victory 9 laps ahead of second place Fireball Roberts.
It was a little Plymouth, and he didn't change no tires. I think he run on average about 65 or 70 mile an hour. And while we was changing tires with lug wrenches, none of this expensive equipment, it took a long time. You get out of your car, eat a hot dog, and drink a drink, and get back, and they have your car ready to go. But he just stayed out there and run. I blowed 22 tires in the first race at Darlington. We was taking tires off of cars out in the infield, because we was running plain tires back then, and that track was just grinding them off. But you'd get used to, we finally found out that we cut a hole in the floorboard, and you could put a timing light, and you could see a white streak coming in the tire, and you knew you had about 2 laps, and you're going to blow a tire. So you got ready and helped the wheel, and we were running on the inside of the track, not where they run today, and you had plenty of time for the car to coast up without hitting the fence.
Mance carried home the $10,000 first prize, but the real winner was Darlington. The Southern 500 immediately became the biggest race of every season. After just 2 years, NASCAR's Grand National circuit quickly grew in popularity. The South finally had a sport to call its own.
Well, there wasn't anything to do. The high school football season was over. There wasn't much basketball. There was a lot of boxing. And in the spring and summer, baseball, there's a lot of minor league baseball teams, but Friday or Saturday night, just about every little town in the Carolinas and Tennessee, there was a race going on, and usually on a quarter-mile to a half-mile track. Plus, the people in the South always had a fascination for cars, and particularly the early Fords. The Fords of the late 30s were very, very easy to make into a race car. Astonishingly enough, there were some very big crowds, considering the almost total lack of media coverage in those days.
Defining the circuit were the drivers. A rough and freewheeling group, the car jockeys came from a variety of backgrounds, but all had one trait in common.
Tough, tough, and tougher. They were tough people. There was very little comfort in a race car back in those days. The driver not only had to be a darn good race driver, he had to be a tough guy when he got out of the car, because somebody sooner or later being probably once or twice a month, was going to fight him. And if he wouldn't stand up for himself, everybody lost confidence in him, and kind of, I've seen it ruin a lot of good race drivers back in those days. But it was a tough place to be.
The era of big car haulers and major sponsor money were years away, so going racing in the early 50s meant towing or even driving your race car to the track.
There was no truck haul in the park. You had an engine, it was in the race car. If that sucker failed, you fixed it at the racetrack. We all stayed in the same dump, motels or hotels. And if Bud Moore needed a cylinder head, and I had one with me, and mine was still running, he had mine, and so on. So we were a totally different deal from now. A great big family. We stayed the same place. We traveled together. Before I'd leave, I'd say, "You got enough money to get home?" And if I had a bad day, you'd ask me if we had enough money to get home. And if I was driving a crippled old car, you would follow me. You know what I mean? And when the race was over, if you'd stay there and help me fix my wrecked car up so that you tow it. You know, we couldn't put it on a flatbed or something. We had to fix it where you could tow it even after you wrecked it. So we ended up being a big family.
NASCAR was on a roll as the 1951 season began, and Bill France was ready to take the Grand National Show to venues outside the Southeast.
The series went out west. We raced at the old Oakland 5/8 mile track in Oakland, California. Had a 250-mile race, I think it was, on the dirt track there at Bay Meadows, which is a horse track there in San Mateo County. 250 miles on a dirt track is a long way because the holes are almost knee-deep by the time you get to, and the deeper the holes get, the more you tear the cars up. But it was taking the series on a national basis.
With new dates on the calendar, NASCAR would begin the 1951 season at home in Daytona. The sanctioning body's popularity brought 54 cars to the Beach Road course that year, with Tim Flock taking the pole at a lap of 102 miles per hour. The starting field was not only large, but diverse. The race had attracted many first-time beach racers, including Bill Holland, the 1949 Indianapolis 500 winner. Flock led the field for the first 110 of 160 miles, but a long fuel stop cost the Atlanta driver the lead.
On the 34th lap, Teague in car number 6 steps on the gas and away from all competition.
Daytona native Marshall Teague took advantage of the pit miscue and cruised to a 1-minute, 14-second win in his Hudson Hornet.
And under the checkered flag comes Marshall Teague, logging a winner's time of 1 hour 36 minutes and averaging a blistering 82.4 miles per hour. Yes, local boy makes good. In the 1951 Grand Circuit Stock Car Race, Daytona's Marshall Teague takes home the cash award, and congratulations from the missus.
Perhaps the most significant race of 1951 was held in Detroit, Michigan. To help celebrate the city's 250th anniversary, Bill France arranged for a race at the Detroit Fairgrounds. Leading up to the race, France worked hard to get the auto manufacturers to back at least one car in the field. By the time the race started, there were 14 different makes of cars in the field and representatives from all the factories in the stands. The Southerners put on quite a show that day, with the lead changing 14 times. Tommy Thompson and Curtis Turner battled for the lead before a collision between the two left Turner broken and made Thompson the winner in a Chrysler. But more importantly, the race piqued the interest of the manufacturers, who've been involved ever since.
I think it brought some awareness to Detroit that we were racing cars. Some of the Detroit auto executives at that time, some knew it, some didn't know it. Oh, I think it was good, and I think they'd be the first to tell you.
But we had all the manufacturers out there, and they was watching these cars, and that's why the cars started getting safer. When we'd break wheels or break the steering, the manufacturers were right up there, and they writing all this down and started beefing up the cars, and it made the cars safer for the American people later on.
North Carolina native Herb Thomas won the Grand National Championship in 1951 by capturing 7 of the 34 races, including the Southern 500 at Darlington. Fonte and Tim Flock finished 2nd and 3rd in the standings. Between the two of them, the Flock brothers won 15 races and had 40 top 5 finishes on the season. The Flock brothers were a vital part of the early racing scene.
This is the famous team of the Flock brothers? I guess you'd call us famous. Well, that's what I hear. They tell me you're a pretty famous outfit. Thank you. This is what? Bob and Tim. And Fonte. Fonte, that's right. They tell me that this whole family of Flocks is a great bunch of racers and busy in all kinds of things that furnishes people with thrills. Is that right? Well, we try to, yes, sir. how long have you been in the racing business, Fonty?
Since 1938.
And what have you been doing in that time?
Just racing stock cars, and I have raced race cars, but not very much.
I see. Well, didn't you win some titles in the NASCAR races?
In 1947, I won the NASCAR championship. In 48, I was second. 49, I won the championship again. And in 1951, I was second.
Well, you've done pretty well, I'd say, during that time.
Yes.
How about you, Bob?
I won a lot of races, but no
championship.
No championship.
Well, you
right.
can't all win all the championships, I suppose.
right.
How about you, Tim?
Well, I'm same as Bob. I've won an awful lot of races, but I never won the championship. I'm going to be active this year, though.
Are you? Well, now, I want to ask you one other question.
Well, that was a merry bunch of guys. Bob and Tim and Fonty, they were great modified drivers when modified racing was the big thing. Tim Flock was the best of the Flock brothers. Tim his driving style reminded me a lot of Bill Elliott's. Very smooth, knew when to get in the corner, knew when to get out, knew when to pass the person. He was patient. He wouldn't wreck the car just trying to get around somebody. He would just keep working his way to the guys. And Tim, all the Flock brothers were characters, particularly Fonty. And Fonty was a showman, and he was always showing up in these crazy get-ups and laughing, and he looked like Clark Gable. He had a little pencil-thin mustache, and he was a neat guy. Tim was extraordinary, though.
Fonty was more colorful off the track. Bob would drive hard. He didn't worry about getting to the checker. If the car made it, he'd be way out in front. Tim was more calculated and tried to be there at the end.
The Flocks all found different ways to win. Tim even had a co-driver. Well, sort of.
One day, Ted walked up to me and said, "Tim, I got an African monkey. Would you ride him in the Hudson Hornet?" I said, "I don't know where NASCAR lets us do that, but if that's what you want, we will." Would you believe he had a uniform made for this monkey and goggles and a cloth helmet? And we slipped him in the first race in the infield, and we didn't dare pull out on the track. We had a perch built where we run full seats back then, and he had an upholstery shop in Atlanta to build a perch where he could look out the window, and we bolted him under 2 safety belts, and right before the race started, we got in line right quick. And would you believe that monkey rode in 8 races with me, and NASCAR couldn't do a thing. They didn't do a thing about it. He run in 8 Grand National races with me, and what really stopped it was we was running on that mile track in Raleigh, and during the race, Fonty was leading the race, and I was running second. Speedy Thompson was in third. He got him under both bells and got down in the car and was screaming around the car, and I finally got him. We was running about 100 miles an hour back then. I finally got him, and it's the only time in history on record that a Grand National car come in the pits to put a live monkey out. I had to make a pit stop and put him out because he was going crazy in that car. I fired him after that, and I told everybody, they want to know why I fired him. I said, well, I never could teach him to sign his autograph.
By 1952, NASCAR had separated itself from the pack of other sanctioning bodies and was ready for its 5th season. Bill France was ready to expand again, this time with a new class. Departing from stock cars, France introduced the Speedway division, featuring Indianapolis-type cars with American stock engines. The class ran 7 races before the national steel strike forced an end to the series.
Well, they were Indy cars with American engines in them, you know, like V8s. I had mine with a Cadillac. Some of them had these big Hemi engines and the head sticking out this far over the side of the frame, you know. Biggest thing about the thing was the engine.
NASCAR was also expanding in other ways. Just as the factories had seen the value in sponsorship the year before, other companies followed suit. A number of companies selling automobile-related products joined with NASCAR in sponsoring its Grand National Points Fund. Sponsorship had existed before, but on a very limited basis.
You got to remember back then, if you like sponsors, we might have a 100-mile race. We might have 73 sponsors, $75 total, 25 from the dealer, 25 from some grocery store, and 25 from some bar. So money was hard to come by.
By late in the 1952 season, 2 drivers were chasing all that new points money, defending champion Herb Thomas and Tim Flock. Thomas had started the season strong before Flock won 7 of 11 races coming into the Labor Day Classic at Darlington, where Tim's brother Fonty would steal the spotlight. Driving an Oldsmobile, Fonty covered the field from the pole and captured the 3rd Southern 500. Fonty celebrated by singing Dixie on the hood of his car before the crowd of 32,000. Flock also had his own version of a cool suit to beat the late summer heat.
The Fonty was a jokester, always cutting up with everybody. All the drivers loved Fonty. He would actually ride around the track at Darlington when he won in '52 and waving at the crowd, and playing the radio, had a radio in the car. But he was a real jokester, and seemed like Fonty had more fans back then, about like Richard Petty does, you know, today. But he cut up with all the drivers, cut up with the fans, won the race in '52 in Bermuda shorts. No one had ever drove a car in Bermuda shorts, and here's Fonty up on the victory circle with a pair of Bermuda shorts waving at the crowd.
Herb Thomas and Tim Flock continued their points battle until the last race of the season at West Palm Beach. Tim Flock only needed to start the race in his Hudson to capture his first points title. Flock began the race without incident, but still managed to win the Grand National title in typical Flock style.
Would you believe during that race I run 64 laps, and going in the first turn I broke an axle. And when you break an axle on the right side of a Hudson Hornet, it flipped the car. The wheel would get up on the wheel well and actually throw the car end over end. And I wound up going end over end in the first turn in the last race, but I had enough laps to still win the '52 championship, upside down.
Safety was becoming a growing concern for NASCAR, and 1953 would be a pivotal year in that area. There had been few fatalities in Grand National racing, but as the speeds increased, the stock cars were having trouble holding up to the punishment. So, with the blessing of NASCAR, the factories began providing severe usage kits to bolster the cars. NASCAR also issued a series of bulletins asking drivers to pay better attention to safety belts and the seat. Roll bars were also encouraged for the first time. It was the start of what would become some of the safest racing in the world today. On the track, Herb Thomas dominated the 1953 Grand National Series. Driving a Hudson Hornet, Thomas set a NASCAR record by winning 12 of 37 races and ran away with the title, beating Lee Petty by 646 points. Thomas was a quiet farmer from North Carolina and was one of the best of his day on the circuit.
He was a very smooth race driver, but when he needed to be aggressive, he could be. But what Herb was really known for was Herb and his Hudson Hornets. And the Hudson, what put Hudson out of business is they were so far ahead of their time with the engineering on those cars. And that's why they made great stock cars, because Herb, you put Herb in a Hudson, watch out.
Thomas drove a Hudson to the title in '53, but wasn't the only one who found success with the Hornet. Hudson ruled the Grand National Series that year by winning 22 of 37 races, including a stretch of 16 out of 20. The Hornet's success came from its inherent design.
Back in them days, the dealer would let you drive anything that he had. So when the new cars come out, we'd go drive all the cars and then decide which one we wanted to make a race car out of. So you drive the Olds and the Ford and the Lincoln and the Hudson and so forth, and the Hudson seemed to have the most potential.
So what made those Hudson Hornets work so great is that they had a floor pan that went down underneath the chassis, and so it made the center of gravity of the car go down. The driver was sitting lower to the deal. And then it had an engine that literally never ran cool all the time. It was the best cooling engine we've ever seen.
You could go on a turn with the Hudson Hornet, turning like 5,800 RPMs, and you come off on the backstretch, you still turning 5,800 RPMs. But with the Oldsmobile 88, you get there and it would start sliding, and you'd probably lose 1,500 RPMs. And that's why the Hudson won races. It would outhandle the other cars in a turn.
As the season began in 1954, it was business as usual on the Grand National Circuit. Herb Thomas won the season opener at West Palm Beach, and Tim Flock easily bested the 62-car field at Daytona. It looked like a great points battle was already shaping up, but after the Daytona race, Tim Flock was disqualified for a carburetor violation, and Lee Petty was declared the winner. Incensed by the ruling, Flock quit the circuit and went back to Atlanta to run his gas station. With Tim Flock gone, the door was wide open for Thomas to become the first three-time champion. Thomas steered his Hornet to 12 victories, including the Southern 500. In 1953 and 54, Herb Thomas had remarkable years, winning 24 of 71 races for a .338 winning percentage. But as gaudy as his stats were, Thomas did not win the 1954 Grand National title. That honor belonged to Lee Petty. The Level Cross, North Carolina native won 7 races, 5 less than Thomas, but was running at the end of all but 2 contests. Petty had won by finishing consistently in his Dodge. Owning and operating his own cars, Petty was known as a good mechanic and a family man on the circuit.
He didn't start driving until he was 35 years old. That's what's so incredible about Lee Petty. And also, he was a smart, cunning, consistent race driver. And he knew how to get the most out of the car, but also when to slow down and not abuse the car.
Lee was a kind of a sneaking driver. He was good, but if he could run over you, he'd do that and say, "Excuse me," you know. And I remember we was on a talk show in Greensboro there once, and he was talking about Richard got his clean driving from him, and I said, "Hell, Lee, you got to remember who you're talking to. This is Buck Baker. You'd run over a guy if you got a chance and they'd say, 'Excuse me.'"
Petty was a smart, patient racer who usually let others wear themselves out battling up front while he drove to give himself a chance to win at the end. NASCAR had shown a good deal of concern toward making their race cars safer in the last few years, but the issue would come to a head in 1955. Several tragic accidents, including the death of 2-time Indy champion Bill Vukovich and a fiery crash that killed 82 spectators in Le Mans, had some calling for an end to racing. The turmoil would eventually cause AAA to withdraw from sanctioning the IndyCar circuit. But NASCAR and Bill France stood tall and weathered the storm. Citing NASCAR's attention to safety, France issued this statement: "NASCAR's reputation has been built on a solid foundation and is continuing to improve safety and sportsmanship on the speedways of America." Cooler heads prevailed and racing continued to grow in popularity. The manufacturers became more involved than ever, confident that victories on Sunday translated into sales on Monday. Chevrolet and Ford poured huge sums of money into NASCAR teams and backed their cars' achievements with national ad campaigns. However, Chrysler would be the big winner in 1955 without spending much money at all. Wisconsin native Carl Kiekhaefer entered the NASCAR scene with the millions of dollars he had made selling his Mercury outboards. Fielding new Chrysler 300s, Kiekhaefer took the plunge into Grand National racing with one purpose: to sell outboard motors. Although it seemed he came from nowhere, Kiekhaefer dominated the circuit for 2 years. In 1955, Kiekhaefer arrived in Daytona ready to race with a fleet of new cars but no driver. It didn't take him long to find a good one.
I had won the 54 race, and Bill France Sr. had disqualified the car and NASCAR. And like I said, it was in February, and I went back to Atlanta and bought a filling station, like starved to death all year long. And a bunch of my buddies said, the race is coming up, you know, the following February, and kept wanting me to go. And I said, I can't leave the station, you know. And finally, they talked me into going. And we went down, we standing on the beach, drinking beer and enjoying ourselves. And this Chrysler, a big white Chrysler 300 came by. And the good Lord must have been listening to me, because I said, boy, if I had that car, I'd win this race again this year. And Tommy Haygood, a Mercury outboard dealer from Orlando, Florida, was standing about 3 foot from me. He says, "What's your name?" I said, "Tim Flock." He says, "I'm one of the dealers for Mr. Carl Kiekhaefer, the Mercury millionaire, and he don't have a driver for that car. Would you like to meet him?" I said, "Man, yeah." And Tommy Haygood put me in a little Mercury outboard truck and drove me over after the Chrysler left the beach. Went over there, and Mr. Kiekhaefer had a brand new filling station. Here's 8 guys with white uniforms on working on that same car. And finally, I got to shake his hand, and he said, "Get in the car and sit down." I knew that I was going to be my car, because he's going to adjust the seat.
Tim Flock won the Daytona Beach Road Race that year, but only after Fireball Roberts had been disqualified during a post-race inspection. An ironic turn for Tim Flock, since he had been stripped of a victory in this same race a year earlier. What's even more amazing about the victory is that Flock did it with an automatic transmission.
And I said, man, there's no way you can win Daytona with an automatic transmission. Do you want to drive the car Flock? I said, yes, I do. But coming off those turns up that backstretch on the north turn, it's kind of uphill, and everybody else had straight transmission, including Fireball Roberts. Coming off that north turn, Fireball and I was running side by side, and I jerked that car down in low, you know, and Fireball was in second. He pulled me 2 blocks going up that backstretch, and then I'd knock it up in drive, and it'd finally get going, and I'd almost catch him in that big old Hemi engine at the end of the south turn. But that's the way we run all day long. I never could get up by him.
Tim Flock and Carl Kiekhaefer went on to have one of the greatest years in NASCAR history in 1955. In the 40 races he entered, Flock won 18 poles and rang up 18 victories, feats that were thought to be unbreakable at the time. Additionally, Tim led every lap in 11 different races. At mid-season, Tim was joined on the Kiekhaefer team by brother Fonty, who won 4 races in his Chrysler 300. The Flocks also finished first and second 4 times in 1955. Kiekhaefer's success was not luck. His racing program was very professional and well-planned.
He was a fanatic, for one thing, a total, complete perfectionist, number 2.
Carl Kiekhaefer was a very intense competitor. I don't know of anybody that's competed up to that point, and very few since that would compete with the intensity that he did. He wanted to win. Everybody wants to win, but he would absolutely go crazy when he didn't win.
He did things back then that were so scientific that they're not even up to it today. And we'd take a reading, just like you'd make out a log, you know, the gear ratio and what jets you was running in the carburetor, what rear end ratio you were running, and tire size. And then when you went back to the racetrack, if you had won or did pretty good, then you just pull out your little black book and go back to the same thing.
Carl Kiekhaefer was a generous man to his employees. Wanting only the trophies and advertising for his outboard motors, Kiekhaefer gave all the prize money to his drivers, who were already making up to $40,000 a year from him. But that didn't mean he was easy to work for.
Boy, he meant business. In fact, he'd go to Daytona later on after we got a bunch of cars running. He'd run a whole motel and get in the middle, put all the drivers on one side and all the wives, and guaranteed nobody was going to go around their wife or girlfriends the night before any race that you're going to run with his cars. And blow a whistle every morning at 6 o'clock. We had to get up. And he had rented an abandoned military airport right outside of Daytona, and we would run those Chrysler 300s all day, just run us till 6 o'clock at night. But when that race started a week later, those cars were ready to win. That's why we won so much.
Even though Tim Flock had the best ride on the Grand National Circuit in 1955, he did not assume the points lead until the 33rd race. Defending champ Lee Petty, also in a Chrysler 300, used his trademark consistency to stay atop the standings most of the season. But once Tim Flock overtook Petty, the rout was on. Flock would win the 1955 Grand National Championship by more than 1,500 points to join Herb Thomas as a 2-time champ. About the only big race Kiekhaefer's Chryslers didn't win in 1955 was the Southern 500, where Herb Thomas completed the comeback story of the year by winning his 3rd Labor Day Classic. Thomas had been hurt badly in a wreck at Charlotte that May, but came back to win 3 races driving his Smoky Unit-prepared Chevy.
Flag for his 3rd victory in the Southern 500.
Kiekhaefer's team made an unbelievable impact in his first year on the Grand National Circuit by winning 22 of 40 races. But that wasn't enough. Kiekhaefer wanted to dominate stock car racing like he did the outboard motor business. So he bolstered his already solid stable of drivers with veteran Buck Baker. Baker had beaten Mr. K's Chryslers a couple of times in '55, so Kiekhaefer figured if you can't beat them, hire them. Kiekhaefer's cars had already won 3 of the first 5 races in 1956 when his team arrived in Daytona that February with 6 cars. It was business as usual for Mr. K's teams. Tim Flock captured the pole with a speed of 135 miles an hour and would start at the head of the 72-car field. Flock then cruised to a 57-second victory in a race that was called because of the incoming tide. The race had a couple of spectacular accidents.
It's
makes Russ Truelove clipping at top speed as he nears the end of a 2-mile straightaway. His trouble started when he drifted out of the groove onto the soft sand.
Including one Ralph Moody, who flipped his new Ford, but managed to land on the wheels, keep racing, and finish third.
It's a good thing for Ralph Moody in number 12 that the sand is soft.
Loaded for bear, Keycaper's Chryslers went on to a record-setting tear that spring. Starting on March 25th, Keycaper cars won a record 16 consecutive Grand National races, a record that may never be broken. That streak is even more amazing when you consider that Tim Flock quit Keycaper after winning the North Wilkesboro race in April. Flock needed a break from the pressure.
He was so tough on us, it really gave me an ulcer, and I had a bad. I went down to 130 pounds racing for Keycaper.
Not missing a beat, Mr. K hired two-time Grand National champ Herb Thomas to replace Flock and continued to roll, winning 21 of the first 25 races. By the middle of the 1956 season, Keycaper's dominance had begun to cause Bill France big headaches. NASCAR's reputation was built on the competitive show it gave spectators. Now, all of that had disappeared, and the fans grew restless. Unhappy with the lack of competition, boos began to shower Mr. K's cars. A frustrated Carl Keycaper was ready to quit, only to stay for the season because he felt obligated to his team, a sentiment not shared by his drivers. Herb Thomas quit the team in July because he felt he wasn't getting the first-line equipment. His departure set the stage for a dramatic points battle between Thomas and Buck Baker, who was still driving the Mercury Outboards Chrysler. As Keycaper teams cooled off in the second half of the season, Herb Thomas got hot, taking the points lead away from Baker in September. The feisty Keycaper wanted to go out a winner and got a late-season race scheduled in Shelby, North Carolina to help Baker shave points off Thomas's lead.
That was back in the days when you, if you want to run another race, you called Bill France up and said, you got an open date 2 weekends from now, we want to run a race up here.
And they promoted this race, and Carl had some interest in it. He wasn't a promoter or anything, but he had some interest in it. And Speedy was my teammate, you know, and I was running out front, we were on the front straightaway when he and Herb got tangled up, and there was some controversy about whether it was set up, you know, intentional or what, but it wasn't anything like that. He didn't operate like that.
The incident between Speedy Thompson and Herb Thomas put Thomas in the hospital with a fractured skull. Baker won the race, but was distraught over the turn of events.
I started just to quit right then, and as time went on, they talked me into it and said, well, you didn't have anything to do with it.
Baker went on to win the 1956 Grand National title by 700 points. Carl Keycaper quit racing and returned to his Wisconsin outboard motor plant with a load of trophies. In his 2 years on the circuit, Keycaper's cars won an untouchable 52 of 90 starts and back-to-back Grand National titles. But Keycaper's legacy is much more than winning. He brought changes that are still a part of racing today. Keycaper took his cars to the track in transport trucks instead of on tow bars. His drivers wore custom suits and kept detailed logs of car setups for each track. Keycaper brought another level of professionalism to racing and showed that meticulous attention to detail paid big benefits.
He was the leader to really putting some pizzazz in the equipment and the race car and the equipment that he hauled it with. Because it was a sight to see those big, beautiful rigs come in, you know, Keycaper aboard, and the number of the automobile on there with the Chrysler 300.
Keycaper introduced a number of innovations that changed the sport and a lot of it in a better way.
One race Keycaper never won was the Southern 500, managing only a second-place finish. In 1956, Curtis Turner beat Speedy Thompson to the line in what was a breakthrough win for Turner. The race began in front of a crowd estimated at 70,000, with Buck Baker on the pole.
The race is on. The front runners roar away, leaving a dust and bit-filled tornado as they head for the first turn. Number 8 jams his Ford into the lead. Thompson's Chrysler is a close second. Goldsmith's Chevrolet is third. Down the backstretch, Pant shows the field his tailpipe.
The first half of the race was very competitive, with the lead changing 14 times. Turner would take the lead just past halfway and go on to win by 2 laps. Although he hadn't gotten a major win until Darlington, Turner was one of the more popular drivers on the circuit. The Virginia native was known for his hard driving and also had an affinity for airplanes and having a good time.
Turner was an unbelievable, best probably natural racing talent that we've ever had in NASCAR. He had a seat-of-the-pants feel for a car that he could drive anything. He knew no limits. He didn't win a lot of races because he usually broke the car. But he certainly won his share.
He would rent a motel, an entire motel, and have a party. And he'd have his own doctors and nurses there to take care of the ones that had a kind of a weak heart or whatever. And then flying his airplane. He was a crazy man in the airplane. I remember Tim Flock and me went to Chicago with him once, and we run right in the middle of a thunderstorm. And we had a fifth of whiskey in the back of the car, and I was kind of looking forward to getting a drink after we got to Chicago, because we ran in that thunderstorm and the airplane was climbing 2,000 feet a minute backwards, you know, and rivets popping out of the wings and everything. And when we finally landed in Chicago, I told Tim, I said, hand me that bottle up here, I'm gonna have me a drink. He said, what drink? I said, hell, I already drank that back there, and you crazy people flying this airplane.
Turner drove a Ford to Victory Circle in '56 and would be part of its factory team in 1957. The manufacturers were into Grand National racing in a big way as the new season began. Selling performance and horsepower, the car companies eagerly used their racing teams to market their autos. The Detroit hype machine soon came under fire, though. The Automobile Manufacturers Association was concerned the rise in horsepower had led to an increasing number of fatalities on the nation's highways. Fearing political backlash, the AMA and the heads of several manufacturers met and decided the industry would have nothing more to do with supporting stock car racing.
They got out of it, and like I say, the reason they got out of it because everybody was talking about speed. And Monday morning after one of the cars won a race, how fast he ran and all this kind of stuff. And I think like I say, American Automobile Association and some of these other bodies started hollering about speed, and using it as a tool for people to go and kill themselves. And but even after the factories got out of it, supposedly, they say they got out of it. I've always had my doubts whether they did or didn't, but everybody survived.
The bottom line of the decision meant that the factory drivers were now team owners. Bill France stepped in immediately to help the teams compensate for the loss of factory money. Increased appearance money and larger purses cut into NASCAR's profits, but kept the tracks and teams in business. Meanwhile, on the track in 1957, Buck Baker won his second consecutive Grand National points title in his own Chevrolet. Baker had a very consistent year, finishing in the top 10 38 out of 40 races to go along with his 10 victories. Baker was a mainstay in the early days and now established as one of his generation's greatest drivers.
Buck was a fantastic race car driver, and he was one of the guys that ran dirt and could run asphalt also.
He was a little, had a little Earnhardt in him. He was not a big man, but he was an intimidating guy. You didn't want him on his back bumper because you didn't know what was going to happen.
Speedy Thompson, Buck Baker's teammate the year before, won the 8th Southern 500 at Darlington. Thompson started 7th and took the lead for the first time on lap 110 until Curtis Turner took the point. Thompson grabbed the lead back 45 laps later and never gave it up.
Moving down the backstretch for the last time, his average speed now 100 miles an hour for 500 miles. The checkered flag. Speedy Thompson in number 46 Chevrolet sets a new record in winning the Southern 500.
1957 also saw one of NASCAR's greatest drivers call it quits. Still recovering from injuries suffered in a crash a year earlier, Herb Thomas decided to retire. Thomas had won 48 Grand National races, 3 Southern 500s, and was the series national champion twice. Many still consider Thomas the best driver of his era.
Thomas was a good driver, maybe the best at that particular time, and won a lot of races. Won a championship or 2.
Thomas's retirement was a signal that NASCAR was entering a transition year in 1958. The factory pullout the season before had been tough enough, but now NASCAR faced a new dilemma. Many of the established stars were aging and not as competitive as they used to be. NASCAR was gaining national popularity and needed a new star to hang its hopes on. Enter Glenn Fireball Roberts.
In the center of the first row, Fireball Roberts, number 22, fastest qualifier of the entire field.
The Daytona native was a good athlete and earned his nickname not from racing, but from baseball. Roberts was not new to the Grand National circuit. He had come in a close second to Bill Rexford in the 1950 Grand National points battle, but then decided to return to the modified ranks after that season. In 1958, Roberts was back in the Grand National division, running a limited slate of races, and was very impressive. In 10 starts, Fireball won 6 races, including a dominating performance at the Southern 500, where he won by 5 laps.
Fireball Roberts in a Chevrolet wins the Southern 500.
At that time, he was probably the best driver after Herb wore himself out. And Fireball operated probably a lot like the drivers do today. He was a pretty smart person. He had probably a higher IQ than most race drivers. But he like Chief Gifford changed the way things go. Fireball changed the way he picked drivers.
He was a good race driver. He ran better on asphalt than he did dirt. And he had an affinity for the super speedways because he reached his peak at the start of the super speedway era in NASCAR.
For the year, Fireball finished 11th in the Grand National point standings. Not impressive until you consider he missed 41 races that year. Of the races he ran in, Roberts led 46% of the laps. Lee Petty won his second Grand National title in 1958 by winning 7 races and finishing in the top 10 44 times. Although Petty and Roberts had great seasons, 1958 will be remembered as the last year of racing on the Beach Road Course. NASCAR had plans to open a new super speedway in Daytona the next winter, bringing 56 years of high speed at low tide to a close. The Grand National regulars gave the old Beach Road Course and a crowd of 35,000 a fitting send-off.
The green flag. The race is on. Through the south turn safely and onto the beach. The leaders jockey for position. There's trouble in the south turn. 2 cars collide, fighting for the first lap position, but no one is hurt.
Paul Goldsmith and Curtis Turner were locked in a battle for the lead when Turner got caught behind slower traffic and spun in the surf.
Turner's out of control. He slides through the safety markers and comes to a stop.
The mishap gave Goldsmith some breathing room, but Turner got another chance. Roaring down the beach on the final lap, Goldsmith didn't see the north turn because of broken windshield wipers and ran past it.
Goldsmith misses a turn. Turner is in sight. Goldsmith gets back onto the track with Turner only yards behind him. Goldsmith streaks for the checkered flag and wins the closest race ever run on Daytona's Beach and Road Course.
The Beach Road Course had been Bill France's foundation for 23 years. NASCAR's first decade had been a success story, but not without a few growing pains along the way. NASCAR was now established as the nation's dominant racing organization. It was time to take the next step. The opening of the Daytona Superspeedway in 1959 marked the beginning of a new era of tracks and drivers to capture the public's imagination. You have to wonder if Big Bill France ever imagined that his love of racing would lead to the formation of NASCAR and this beautiful 2.5-mile superspeedway here in Daytona Beach. What we do know is that the first 10 years of NASCAR were very successful and that a lot of new challenges lie ahead. Over the next decade, things like television, sponsorship, and increased support from the factories would all impact the sport of NASCAR racing. The real story, though, would remain the drivers, the heroes of the sport. A new generation was coming along, ready to be passed the torch by their predecessors, including a friendly young man from Randleman, North Carolina, who would forever impact the sport in its history books. It's all in the years ahead in the NASCAR story.